Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Al Rain, the co-chair of Boston Harbor Now's Policy and Planning Committee, and I'll be the host for this morning's forum. Boston Harbor Now convenes these meetings to enable members of the public to learn more about both public and private projects happening around the waterfront. If this is your first time at one of these forums, welcome. And if you've attended before, welcome back. Word about Boston Harbor Now. We're a nonprofit organization focused on ensuring that the waterfront and the harbor islands are increasingly prepared for the coastal impacts of climate change, and that they provide welcoming and inclusive open space and indoor uses to people from all over Greater Boston. We call this idea Harbor Walk 2.0. Our work spans a wide range of issues, from commenting on waterfront development projects to planning for future ferry service to bringing underserved communities out to experience the harbor islands. Boston Harbor Now believes strongly that the waterfront belongs to all of us, and that by bringing together interactive conversations like this one this morning, we can help ensure that projects are both inclusive and resilient. Today, we're excited to take a look outside Boston and learn some lessons from the city of Salem and the work that Salem is doing on its waterfront. We'd like to begin by asking two quick poll questions to learn more about who's with us here today. So the first question is, what industry do you work in? Public sector, private sector, whether development or wind industry or consultants, nonprofit, education, or other? Okay, the second question is, what's your familiarity with offshore wind and that industry in Massachusetts? Would you say that you're very familiar, like you work in the wind industry, somewhat familiar, you work in a related industry, energy, ports, etc., a little bit familiar, you read about it or attend meetings on it, or not familiar, and this is a new topic? So as you can see from the graph, a lot of people here from the private sector, few people here from the public sector, some nonprofits and some others. And in terms of familiarity with the offshore wind industry, oops, does that have to, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I can scroll down. The awesome power of the chair. As you might expect, most people are a little bit familiar and in decreasing numbers, somewhat familiar and very familiar. So we've got a wide range of knowledge and familiarity with the issue, but for most of us, we know something and we're going to learn a lot more, at least from the perspective of the Salem project in this morning's forum. So let me say a word about Salem and then hand it over to our guests. I think you all know where Salem is, but it's 16 miles north of Boston. If you haven't taken it, there's a great 1-hour ferry ride to Long Wharf. Salem has been planning for the future of their waterfront for a long time and developing interesting new projects, both in their designated port area where the old coal-fired power plant was, and in housing along the waterfront. And you're going to hear about both of those things today. We're going to be joined by four presenters. Tom Daniel, the Director of Planning and Community Development for the City of Salem, will lead off and give an overview and set the stage. Then Seth Lattrell, who was formerly Salem's Port Authority Director and Port Planner, will talk about the evolution of the city's port from a coal-fired power plant, as I mentioned, to a multi-use site with a focus on new offshore wind terminal. And then Courtney Koslow, the Development Director at Beacon Communities, and Ann Martin, the Director of Ecological Services at LAE Environmental Consultants, will talk about their affordable passive house redevelopment project at Leefort Terrace. And when all these presentations are done, we'll open this up and have a great conversation. Tom, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Al. Just bringing up my slides. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. And I'm just going to provide some background and some policy context that ties into what Seth and Courtney and Ann will be talking about later. I'm starting this background slide, for those that you don't know, is the Custom House, the National Parks Salem Maritime Historic Site with the Friendship in the foreground. And this is intentional. Salem's history is tied to the water and is part of the identity and fabric of the community. And yet, in the late 20th century, there was, I think, less connection to the water, which has been what our waterfront planning has been focused on. Okay, my slide's not advancing. There we go. So just to put things in a broad context, about 5 years ago, we did a citywide visioning process called Imagine Salem, and this was really meeting with people throughout the city about what they love about Salem, what they hope for Salem, especially as we're looking at 2026 when Salem is commemorating its 400th year as a community. And these policy domains are things that we talked about through a lens of equity. And these policy areas are all interconnected. What came out on top in terms of a value was diversity, and that was in all aspects. It was age, socioeconomic status, race, heritage, sexual orientation. People really valued the diversity of the people who lived here. And as we were going through this engagement and providing quantitative data about our jobs and housing and other areas, people were realizing, like, wow, the housing costs are going up. Our jobs a lot of them are service industry and are low and moderate income paying, and there's a disconnect here. So people, as Mayor Driscoll, when she was mayor, would say, the people pouring your coffee in the morning or your beer at night used to be able to live here in Salem, and that's shifting a lot. And so this is a broader context for the work that we're doing. I wanted to start just with referencing the 2008 Harbor Plan. Salem's been focused on the waterfront for decades before the 2008 Harbor Plan, but just to orient you, this greenish area here is where the former coal oil power plant was. It's where the wind port will be going. Up here at the top of the screen is Leefort Terrace, where Courtney's project is based. And so, as I mentioned, there's been a real effort to connect to the waterfront and activate it. Just to provide a couple updates, points, this north commercial waterfront around Blaney Street was one area of a lot of focus. So this was an area that was just in really rough shape, from both the port or waterside infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure. Our colleague, who's since retired, Kathy Wynn, led the development of the Blaney Street Wharf here. This, as Al mentioned, is where our Nathaniel Bowditch ferry operates out of. It's also allowed us to receive cruise ship vessels. We're not a major cruise destination, but this has been one other layer of activation for Salem. But the ferry is sort of the sort of day in, day out during the season of activated use. We're unique in that the city owns the ferry. This services commuters into Boston as well as visitors. And it works really because of that visitor market that's subsidizing the cost of the operations. A second area that I just wanted to talk about briefly was over here on the left of the screen. This is part of our South Commercial Waterfront and the South River. Up at the top here, this is downtown Salem. It's easy to be in downtown Salem and have no idea that, the ocean is just a stone's throw away. So efforts to connect to the water. This is looking at the South River. Again, downtown is over here. So back in 2008, 2009, we built out the first part of the harbor walk around the South River. As uses on this side converted over, we continued. So now we have a continuous harbor walk around here connecting to Pickering Wharf and the harbor walk that they have, and then the National Park Service Salem Maritime site. So the South River area, had industrial uses. This is a small park that we developed at the same time that the first leg of the harbor walk went in. And then Mayor Driscoll, we acquired a former gas station site that was used in October for our carnival, and built a new park, Charlotte Fortin Park, where it really provides a connection to the water, access out onto the water, and then also just passive swings, as well as programming that happens there to afford people the opportunity to see and interact with the water. So I want to shift and talk about housing. I know that's not the focus of this group, but it's really been a focus of the city, coming from Imagine Salem, that really set the baseline for communities' awareness, as I mentioned, about the increasing cost of housing and how that jeopardizes the values of the community. This is the vision for housing in Salem. And we've done a tremendous amount of policy work over the past 4 to 5 years. Sorry, go here, looking at how we support public activity in producing housing, especially housing that's affordable to folks at 60% of the area median income or below. That's really the target that we're having. And we're not unique in the metropolitan area or in the Commonwealth, where housing is just a crisis. Our income, the average income in Salem has increased at a slower rate than Greater Boston, and our housing prices have just increased, astronomically. We are working with private and nonprofit development partners to provide new housing opportunities. This bar graph, what I wanted to highlight was under the permitted and pipeline, the purple columns are showing the numbers of affordable units. So what we have permitted and in the pipeline is a higher percentage of affordable units than in the past. The Leefort Terrace is up here at the top. We've got the Exchange working with WIN. North Shore CDC is converting 2 former Catholic schools to housing, and they're also leading a new community health center and affordable units. 3 of these 4 projects are subject to flooding as well. So this is where the intersection of our housing policy work and climate resiliency work comes together. So just to show, this is showing the 20, 30, 50, and 70 flood potential. So the wind port is here. The beacon housing is up here. The wind development project is here, and the North Shore CDC Health Center project is about here. And I think what we're trying to do is talk about how do you support housing development where you're in vulnerable areas. And as we've done a tremendous amount, as I mentioned, education outreach around housing and housing policy. And similarly, we've been doing a lot of work around climate for about the past 10 years. Some of this is city-led, some of it's working with partners like Salem Sound Coast Watch. Many of these are planning studies or gathering meetings. We also have policy work. Last year, we amended our wetlands ordinance and provide climate adaptation as a value in that, so that the Conservation Commission has some jurisdiction on that. We're currently working on our flood hazard overlay zoning district, as well as a new flood resiliency overlay, and that's currently in development and going through the public process. I did want to just call out our joint project with the city of Beverly, Salem and Beverly Resilient Together Climate Action Plan. That's really been a great project and plan that's led to other work. We went forward in looking at one of our neighborhoods, the Point, El Punto neighborhood, to do a deep dive. So just to orient you, again, downtown is on this side of the screen. We've got the wind port up here and Leefort Terrace over here. The Point neighborhood is an environmental justice community. It's got our highest concentration of poverty. It has a large percentage of immigrants, mostly from the Dominican Republic. is vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding, as well as precipitation events. This is a low spot. It's also a very hot area, so it's subject to higher temperatures and heat island effect. And so we did a deep dive last year. Our colleagues in our newer sustainability and resiliency department led this project, working with us in planning, and a real robust engagement with community members that was looking at conceptually what are some interventions to support resiliency in this neighborhood. We've got South River up here with Charlotte and Fortin Park, and a number of different strategies that are called out here as ideas for further exploration and development. Down here in Palmer Cove Park, this is an active park improvement project. We've made some near-term modifications in terms of that park plan based on the study, and we're actually doing a deeper analysis now to look at long-term resiliency infrastructure that can be incorporated in a future phase. Concurrently, work is going on with the neighborhood and community members to continue to engage around this and look at resiliency. And we're really doing this with an equity lens. So this is kind of a culminating graphic that's looking at multiple interventions to look at supporting the neighborhood and protecting it. We also talk about jobs and housing in this study. So it really is going back to that Imagine Salem wheel, the connecting of all the dots. This is a deep dive that we're also doing in another hit neighborhood, and we'll be looking forward to carrying out further. On the horizon, I want to just flag this large white building here. This is Shetland Park, which is a 1.5 million square foot commercial industrial complex. The new owners are looking to add in housing in here, and coastal resiliency, as well as stormwater management are key considerations for this project. A lot yet to be sorted through. But we look forward to continuing, as I said, this integration of our waterfront planning with housing and opportunities and our coastal resiliency. And look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Tom, thanks very much. Now we're going to hear from Seth about Salem's working port and the new wind facilities. Seth?
Perfect. Thank you. Well, 1 second. I'm just going to share my screen. And Tom, that was the first time I saw that you can use a laser pointer, so I'm stealing that trick. That was cool.
It's helpful, isn't it?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Seth Lattrell. You guys can all see my screen, correct? Make sure I'm sharing the right one.
Yes.
So I'm Seth Lattrell. I'm now at VHB, but just a couple months ago, I was the Port Authority Deputy with the City of Salem, working with Tom on our municipal harbor planning efforts and leading the planning that led to our offshore wind opportunity. So just to sort of walk through what I'm going to discuss today. So I'm going to touch a little bit on Salem's maritime tradition, sort of expanding on what Tom presented about Salem's relationship with its waterfront. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the power plant, which is the property that is being proposed for offshore wind today. I'll walk through our harbor plan, talk a little bit more about the site, talk broadly about offshore wind. It's nice that the majority of folks here have some offshore wind familiarity. And then I'll touch quickly on the redevelopment project itself. So just to dive in a little bit, I think it's always, exciting for me to think about Salem's history with its waterfront and its relationship. And it dates back sort of pre-European settlement. Salem was called Namkeg, which the Native Americans at the time, that was the word for the fishing place. And then during the sort of Revolutionary War to Industrial Revolution period, Salem rose to great prominence, largely due to the spice trade. So that was the great age of sail. Salem became the richest city in the nation per capita and one of the largest cities in the nation. As industrialization started to take over, Salem's relationship with its waterfront really changed. It started, and specifically on this property, to look more towards energy production and energy development. So the site that we're going to be talking about for offshore wind during that 1830s period was being used for coal import. So there was a direct line connection, rail connection that led from what was then Phillips Pier all the way into Lawrence and Lowell. So Salem was literally fueling the Industrial Revolution in the mills in that area. In the 1900s, that started to shift. By 1950, we were developing the first coal-fired power plant in Salem. It was one of what's referred to as the Filthy Five, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but one of the dirtiest power plants in the country. And then, as I'll expand on in this next slide, 2018, that coal-fired power plant was replaced with a new natural gas-fired plant. So these are images of the prior power plant and the current power plant. So as I mentioned, it was coal-fired, then was oil-fired for a little while, then coal-fired again. One of the troublesome things that we heard a lot about when we were going through the community engagement process for looking at this property was just how dirty this power plant actually was. The power plant had to regularly clean or pay for cleaning of boats and houses and cars throughout the community, led to a lot of the environmental justice issues in Salem that we're still dealing with today. So by 2018, that power plant was redeveloped, into a quick start natural gas fired facility. It was actually, it was something that came out of a community process. That there was a lot of discussion around the need for power generation in this region, and ultimately it was supported heavily by the community that we were replacing this dirty power plant with something much cleaner, and it really sort of served as this transition from our traditional energy sources to renewable power. That it's a quick start facility, it's gas fired, a much smaller footprint, so it can come online to serve in those interim periods where renewables aren't necessarily producing. So if the wind's not blowing, sun's not shining, we're going to rely on facilities like this until we can have more robust energy storage systems. Really important to the offshore wind development is the footprint of this the new power plant. So the prior coal and oil fired power plant was a 65-acre facility. This new facility was shrunk down to 23 acres. There's also an agreement for that new power plant, which I just think is helpful to keep in mind, that it's set to cease operation by 2050. So it really is intended to serve as this interim power source for the region. So by shrinking that footprint, it also freed up the rest of the property, the 42 acres for redevelopment. And this is something that the city's been talking about for many years. And we really started the conversation 8 or 9 years ago, and talking about what was the potential use, or what were the potential uses for this 42-acre waterfront site. So we recognized early on that traditional marine industrial uses were just not necessarily viable on this property. The saying was salt, scrap, and Subarus. This is a residential area. It's a block away from the House of Seven Gables. It's in a historic neighborhood. So we decided to kick off a community engagement process through a municipal harbor plan. So we kicked off that effort in August of 2020. We had dozens of meetings, a whole interactive mapping tool. We had surveys to talk about what were the priorities for the property. And really at the time, what we were anticipating was that there would be a push to try and create some sort of mix of uses on the property. But what we heard was that there was some development fatigue, and people really wanted to see the port preserved, particularly with renewable energy and offshore wind. Again, that was 2020, prior administration. Offshore wind, there wasn't necessarily the same market for offshore wind at the time, and I'll touch more on that, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that at that time, we did not have an approved offshore wind project in the nation. So we decided to take a step back and look at what were the sort of physical attributes of this property, what were the constraints, and what did the offshore wind market look like? What was on the horizon? What was the anticipated timing for some of the projects? So this is just a high-level overview of what the property is. As I mentioned, it's 42 acres. It surrounds that existing natural gas-fired power plant, which is much nicer looking nowadays, but I didn't have an updated aerial now. It's very nicely landscaped. But the property is large enough. It has deep water access straight to the federal channel. And really importantly, it has no overhead restriction. So when we started to look at other ports in Massachusetts, but actually really across the East Coast, there are very few ports that have these attributes. Most ports have a bridge or power lines or an airport nearby that constrains the height requirements. And I'll touch on the next slides on why that's important. But we also, as I mentioned, recognize that it's immediately adjacent to a historic neighborhood. There's poor upland access. So, those traditional uses, salt scrap Subarus, really couldn't get in and out by road. And there's no rail connectivity. It was also 200 miles away from the offshore wind lease areas. So just to touch high level on offshore wind to set the stage here, offshore wind in Massachusetts is not new, but it has advanced dramatically over the past couple of years. So the installation areas that are approved right now are all south of Martha's Vineyard. This slide's a little bit outdated. There's now additional developers and new agreements between these developers, but these are the general locations. And offshore wind is going to be a critical generation aspect for our transition to renewables. As we see big power plants like Salem, Brayton Point, the Pilgrim nuclear power plant come offline, the Commonwealth is going to rely heavily on offshore wind to replace that generation. So to date, we have 5,600 megawatts that are approved for procurement. The most recent procurement just got put out yesterday, but that 5,600 megawatts is the equivalent of probably about 5 large power plants. So just for a sense of scale. The turbines themselves are massive, and this was something that was really interesting to us at the beginning because it's what makes Salem really appealing for the offshore wind industry. The components are too big to take by road, so we really rely on ports to be able to move these components. So these are just a few facts. I won't go into detail, but just for a sense of scale, the GE Haliade X is the turbine that's being used right now for Vineyard Wind 1, which is the first project in the country to be permitted and now is in the early stages of installation. That turbine has blades that are longer than a football field. It's over twice the height, I was just looking this up, of the onshore turbine that we see on the Boston Everett line over by the casino, which I think is about 364 feet. So really massive structures, and that allows the industry to be more efficient and cost effective. But as I mentioned, because they're so big, we need ports. And this is a really exciting opportunity for ports across the country. There's really 3 different types of ports. There's marshalling and construction staging ports, and that's what Salem's being developed for. Those are essentially a pre-assembly and staging area where the components themselves come in from manufacturing ports, are strategically positioned on the property, and then loaded onto either a barge or an installation vessel for the actual install out at the lease area. Second type of port is a manufacturing port. That's what's being done down at Brayton Point with the cable manufacturing facility at Prysmian. There's also manufacturing ports that are being developed right now down in New York for the towers themselves, the nacelles and the blades. And then the third is an operations and maintenance port. And there's a couple of operations and maintenance ports being considered right now within the Commonwealth. But it was helpful for us when we were looking at Salem to understand what the potential opportunity was. But as I mentioned, we were going through this process in 2020, or starting in 2020. So I like to just go quickly through this timeline because it's really kind of critical to how this opportunity came together. So we started the conversation in 2020. We had a whole series of community meetings talking about the need for offshore wind, the desire to see offshore wind developed on the property. But it really didn't come together until March of 21, when the Biden administration put out their 30 by 2030 goals. That set the stage for the industry and really catalyzed the demand for port space. For the nation to be able to achieve that goal, we need essentially all of the potential ports that could marshal offshore wind to be utilized. So after that March 2021 30 by 2030 goal was set, we worked with the property owner to put out a request for expressions of interest. And very quickly, we found out that there was quite a bit of offshore wind interest. So September of 2021, we came together with a public-private partnership between then Vineyard Wind, and it ended up sort of being the partners of Vineyard Wind after their breakup. So a partnership with Avangrid and with Crowley. And I'll talk a little bit more about who they are in the next slide. And they were tied to the Commonwealth Wind bid, which was awarded in 2021. So we really hit the ground running in December 2021. So the project itself, as I mentioned, it's a partnership with Crowley and the partners of Vineyard Wind. Crowley is the largest employer of U.S. mariners, civilian mariners. They're a major marine logistics transportation company with a long history within the United States, and they're making a huge splash right now into the offshore wind industry. So Crowley is going to be the developer and operator of the port, and they will lease the property first to Avangrid for the deployment of two of their initial projects, Commonwealth Wind and Park City Wind. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. So that's the equivalent of really 2 large power plants that's being deployed. The property itself will be co-owned by the city of Mass CEC, who will then lease and sublease for Crowley to operate and Avangrid to utilize. And the project to date has been supported with over $110 million in public funding. So these are just a couple of images showing sort of a rough rendering of what the property will look like. So it's really pretty simple. There's no significant buildings being proposed on the site. It's really just a staging and assembly space. Because these components are so large and so expensive, it's a fairly low impact use. There's not a lot of loud noises. There's not a lot of dust. It's very careful operation. So the project is now in the permitting phase, and it's been amazing to see how much support this project has gotten locally in Salem because of all this upfront work and that engagement that we had. So I will pause there and can do questions after, but I will turn it back to you, Al. Al, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was avoiding my barking dog a moment ago. Seth, thank you very much. Courtney and Ann, let's hear about Leefort Terrace.
Great. Hi, everybody. I am Courtney Koslow, Development Director at Beacon Communities, and I am joined today with Ann Martin from LEC Environmental, who was pivotal in getting our all of the permitting that we needed through here. We also have the participants, several other members of our team joining in who could help answer questions later. They include Monique Hall from Brown Richardson Rowe, our landscape architect, Rachel Powers, Development Associate at Beacon, Stephen Materano, and Molly Obendorf from Bowler, our civil engineers. Okay. Here we are. So just a quick moment on who Beacon is. We are a Boston-based large for-profit affordable housing developer, manager, and owner. We've been around since the late 60s, have grown quite a bit. We now have offices in Boston, Buffalo, New York City, and Pittsburgh. And we have a presence, very large presence in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, as well as the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states for a total of 19,000 apartment homes. We refer to ourselves as a mission-driven for-profit. We are committed to doing the best by our communities and residents. And we are partnering on Leefort Terrace here with the Salem Housing Authority. They are a very well-run housing authority who had identified the needs for their properties that they were not able to use the current funding for public housing to do right by these properties, and brought in Beacon, a partner specifically on Leefort Terrace. I mentioned our team who is here, and we also have Icon Architecture as the building architect, and Waypoint KLA as their owner's rep. I think the folks before me, Tom and Seth, did a great job explaining where we're located, the site. So right across from the footpath site, and So we're here, that was just here, and here's Leefort downtown. The friendship that Tom showed is right here, House of the Seven Gables. So right, and this is Collins Cove is what we are adjacent to, and this right here is a bridge to Beverly. So and a commuter rail about a mile away. So Leefort Terrace today is 50 units of state public housing for elderly and disabled households. It was built in 1958, and these are small units. There's no accessibility, but it's made for senior and disabled households. Funding for state public housing is actually something that Massachusetts is, we're lucky to have state public housing. Many states do not have it, but funding, particularly for elderly and disabled housing, is very low and did not enable the Housing Authority to really do the work that would need to be done to make these livable into the future. And also, we are in a floodplain today. This is at 10 feet right now on average, the site, which is where today's floodplain is. So as we look into the future, this is not the right place for this. I do also want to mention, maybe go back here for a moment. This site was all infill. Before 1958, there was nothing in this location. So this was filled in. This whole, what is it called? We call this, this whole neck, the Salem neck area. It had a really narrow, one kind of little small set of land that connected out to the Salem Willows over here, which is today a nice recreational neighborhood, seaside neighborhood. It was filled in over time. There was a town dump on one side, a leather factory on the other. That's been cleaned up. Well, at least the dump has into a park. So this is the only use that has been on this site since it's been infilled is Leefort Terrace. Tom showed versions of this. This is just looking out to 2030. We know that water will come in the site, and this was a key factor in our planning for what to do here. We talked a lot about, is this the right site for development, given what we know will very likely inevitably be happening here. And as you'll see, I think we created a plan for development that really does work with the water and the future. So I'll turn to Anne just to talk a little bit more about the existing conditions.
Sure. Thanks, Courtney. This is just an existing conditions plan to give you a little bit of context. The red line is the property boundary. This is only a 3.5 acre property. We are along the shoreline of the Collins Cove. The coastal flooding comes in from both directions, actually, but primarily from Collins Cove. Right now, the FEMA floodplain elevation is 10. But as Courtney referred to, when we take into consideration sea level rise, that elevation is going to be even higher. We have some slides that show that. But you can see on the plan that basically the units are little islands that are just barely elevated above the floodplain. This played a key role in our design process, as well as that 250 feet from the shoreline is jurisdictional under tidelands. Because this property is owned by the Salem Housing Authority, they are considered a Commonwealth tidelands that keeps them protected to a higher level. You'll see when you see our design that as a result, we kept all of the buildings and anything that was for private for the residents outside of the tidelands, and designed a publicly accessible park within the Commonwealth tidelands.
There might have been one more, but okay. So we created this vision statement to take us through our process in the design, as we wanted to make sure we're holding tight. So I'll read it here, that we thought of this as a rescue mission to replace these existing 50 obsolete apartments. And our plan is to put 124 new in a new building, take down these buildings, 100% affordable, environmentally forward, climate resilient rental housing, community where residents can thrive. It was also a great opportunity for the Housing Authority to use this property that they already own to provide additional affordable housing, which we all know is so needed, and half the battle with getting this is finding sites that are affordable. acquisition prices to be able to make them into affordable housing. So this is a great opportunity. I don't know if I mentioned this, these are all garden style, 1-story apartments. There's about 8 buildings that these 50 units are clustered in. We created sustainability goals. We had a green charrette. They focus on resiliency. We do want to also be a resiliency hub, and we're now looking at backup battery power. We wanted, I talk about environmentally positive. I think in the past, we were trying to build buildings that were less bad, but we actually need to build buildings that are carbon sequestering. Thinking about the materials we use, their embodied carbon, the life cycle of all the materials that go into it, and also using the landscaping as a way to sequester carbon and help to manage water. We have goals of low energy building design to strive for carbon neutral, and also to be healthy and human centered in our goals. So what that came up with here is the site plan for the new building that we are working towards developing. You'll see the limits of Commonwealth Thailand is here. So in this 1.26 acres, I believe, is this publicly accessible open space. I should note that going forward, Salem Housing Authority will continue to own the land. Beacon Communities will own the building and manage the property. So we will maintain this publicly accessible park that we built with a community group that we pulled together to help us decide what would work best for the community here. We have 3- and 4-story buildings in a U-shaped with additional kind of more private residential areas, a private outdoor space for residences. These will be 100% affordable, 124 units for 99 years. They're 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. This will be an intergenerational building, so at least 50 of the replacement units will have restrictions for elderly families. This is universally designed. We thought a lot about not just making this accessible for ADA compliance, but also how could everybody that approaches this building approach it in the same way and be able to navigate in ways regardless of their abilities in the same way to navigate the building. This will be a passive house certified building, which means a very, very high performing, very tight envelope, all electric, solar PV, and I'll talk a little bit about the climate resilient design and how we built this up. I mean, I should say 3- and 4-story buildings above a podium basement. So the parking is built up a little bit to about 11.5 feet above sea level. And I'll talk a little bit more about the height of the other levels. Lots of amenities, central air conditioning in every unit that's part of the all electric systems, and some parking, EV charging stations, covered bike parking, and some outdoor bike parking as well. Here's an image, a rendering of the Collins Cove side with the publicly accessible open space in the front. So our back is to the water in this image. A courtyard view looking in. And then a little bit about the grading here. So here's the this is the Collins Cove side. We'll be building up that park up to the building a bit. And this is the courtyard side. So this is a section, a slice in. And we're building that courtyard up such that you walk into the lobby at 13.6 feet above sea level, which using various data sets available, we predict is about where the 2070 lower end of the flood zone. Sorry, we built it at 14.6. So here we're showing where predictions are showing the lowest of sea level rise and the highest. So we built the lobby there. The basement level is at 10, I think it's actually now, sorry, 11 feet. So above the current floodplain of 10. And the residential ground floors are 23 feet above sea level, so well above 2070 expected floodplain levels and sea level rise. So we can imagine that there will be times where residents will need to move their cars from the basement garage level as that may flood. But Anne will talk a little bit more about how we're managing that water. But this is a place where people can shelter in place. We expect to have backup power, limited backup power, but including some plug loads and a refrigerator and access to the community kitchen in the community room so people can stay safe. Also, being a passive house building, this building should retain a comfortable temperature for 2 or 3 weeks should the power go out. We would keep on the energy recovery ventilators, the fresh air that goes in and out during power outage, so that there can be potentially some of that air coming in and out, but this building is resilient in that way as well. The permitting that we needed here, we've already gone through an extensive permitting process with the city. So we received our Chapter 40B comprehensive permit, which is, you may know, an affordable housing zoning tool that allowed us to do the kind of what we planned here, even though it wasn't exactly allowed by right. We have already our Conservation Commission order of conditions. We've received the MIPA certificate, and we are now currently under Chapter 91 licensing review process. So I will turn it over to Anne.
Thanks, Courtney. I wanted to just stop for a minute and share a few things that made this project successful, or that we felt like helped make this project successful. I think that might be why some of you have signed on. Is very early in the process, we were coordinating with state and local agencies. We had a lot of early discussions with them about what the community needed, what were the existing conditions, how to go about design of the project. Courtney referred earlier to the design of the public open space. There was a committee that was created that members of the public, people who are interested in it, current residents or people who lived in the neighborhood, participated in, that really fed into the development of the design of that open space. We're not going to show you the slides that show the development of that, but over time, and when I talk about it a little bit more, I'll point out some of the features, but the people who will use this park really played a significant role in the design, and the features were there because we had the opportunity to receive feedback from them on that. Same thing for the design of the building and the private space for the residents. Courtney and the team really spent a lot of time talking to current residents about what is it that you want this building to be. So it was not a process where our team got together and said, this is what we think these people need, this is what we think the future residents need, but there was a lot of time spent talking to who the residents will be to make sure that we were really meeting their needs. And I think that was a really key part of the success of the project. So I just kind of wanted to get that in there. For the grading design and for stormwater, you know, everything is, all the accessibility in the paths are sloped at 5%. There's no ramps. Courtney talked a little bit earlier about how we elevated the building. We also, the civil engineer graded the site. So much of the site is going to be up out of the floodplain. Basically, the front part of the site fronting on Collins Cove, where the park is, a portion of that is just barely in the floodplain now. And the entrance off of Fort Ave is around elevation 10. Everything else we really pulled up out of the coastal floodplain to elevate the surrounding landscape, not just the building. The project meets DEP stormwater management standards. We spent a lot of time focusing on low impact development design. We coordinated a lot with the peer reviewer who was retained by the Conservation Commission and the city engineering department. They were very interested in our ability to look at this design and design the LID features and infiltration and early pre-stormwater treatment to the maximum extent. And so the design engineers really looked at the flooding situation and at what point would the site be inundated. And that really led the design for how we could design these features to get the maximum infiltration on the site before any floodwater started to come in. We looked at this both under existing conditions and moving towards sea level rise. Next slide. So this really focuses in on the public accessible area. There's we've talked a lot about shade trees, the vegetation, making sure that that was coastal resilient, design of the rain gardens, focusing on native plants to New England or plants that have naturalized here and that are coastal resilient. A lot of meadow grasses for pollinator habitat. There's several different types of pathways. There's concrete pathways that are flanked by grasscrete that run through the site that enable fire access through the park. And then there's also stone dust. All of this is ADA accessible. Some of the things that came into the project with greater clarity from participation by the neighborhood is cafe tables, all different types of seating, benching, picnic tables. There's posts for hammocks where people can bring hammocks and lay in hammocks. They were involved in input on, the type of vegetation and the understory trees and what kind of experience they were really interested in using this park. We also designed opportunities for public art and sculpture. Right now, along the existing bike path along Collins Cove, there is public art. So we wanted to design into this the opportunity in the future for there to be public art as part of the park. And of course, there's the traditional bike racks, both trash and recycling receptacles, dog waste bags, really everything that one would expect from a park that was available to the public. And this shows you some of the open space areas that are reserved for the residents. There's a multi-use lawn. There are courtyards with seating to give both interior and exterior areas for residents to gather and experience the environment. There are bocce courts, and then there's a fairly large victory garden.
Well, Courtney and Ann, thank you very much. That was wonderful, and thanks to all the presenters. These are inspiring projects. Two very different kinds of activity from which we can all gain a lot of lessons. So we're going to have a conversation now. There are two ways, if you're in the audience, there are two ways that you can get a question into this. Use the chat, and Alice will be monitoring the chat. If you want to use the electronic raise hand, not the physical raise hand, but the electronic raise hand, Alice will look for that as well. I'm going to kick this off by asking, I'm going to take the extreme liberty of the chair and ask a brief question about each project and answer them in whatever order you want or defer them. But on the port, a sort of philosophical planning question, Seth and Tom, to what degree is the permanent future of the facility viewed as being offshore wind, and to what degree is that viewed as a finite thing? You don't know how many years that activity will be in place, but that it will naturally run out at some point. I don't know the answer to that question, but I would think that was an important sort of threshold thing to have your heads around when you came to this very exciting conclusion of what to do on that part of the DPA. And for Ann and Courtney, Courtney, I guess you in particular, from the development standpoint, obviously every project's different. You can't overgeneralize from one. That said, to what degree do you feel that the cost of the resiliency measures, once baked into a project that you're out front of from the outset, to what degree does that actually show up in the deal as a cost premium, and to what degree, if you're completely out front of it, does it get buried in everything else? I don't know the answer to that question either. So I'll throw those two out there, and anyway, if anyone wants to take either of those, then Alice will take questions from everybody else.
Thanks, Al. I can jump on the on sort of the what the long-term vision is for the Port of Salem. It's a great question. It's something that took us a while to really wrap our heads around, and I think I also probably didn't explain enough about sort of the nature of how these materials are transported. So when we're talking about sort of the near term for this use as a construction staging port, we have a first lease with Avangrid We have an option with another developer for a lease after that. But we still have a long pipeline of other projects that are going to be following those projects in those existing lease areas south of Martha's Vineyard. And when we start to look at that projection, it starts to align with the longer term installations that are anticipated in the Gulf of Maine. So that's something that right now is in sort of the early planning stages. The Gulf of Maine is much deeper, so they have to use a different technology. It's floating offshore wind, which right now is really in its infancy. There's, I think the first utility scale projects are just starting to take off. This is the same technology that they're going to rely on the West Coast. So the projects that are proposed right now off California. The Gulf of Maine work, that's where Salem is uniquely positioned. Because we don't have any overhead restriction, you can float a turbine from Salem directly to the installation areas. And there is a very short list of ports on the East Coast that have that capability. So we see this sort of long-term, I should say midterm period for the installation. But as we look out to that 20-year projection, then we start getting into that operations and maintenance side where, these structures are going to start to phase out. They're going to be upgraded, replaced. So this is something that we anticipate being a long-term use for Salem. And then we can start to align it with that 2050 horizon where the 23-acre power plant is going to be retired. So that's when we can start to maybe reimagine what Salem's role is. But yeah, it is something that we anticipate being a long-term use and is, and certainly Crowley's investment in the property. I see we have Joe St. Pierre with Crowley on here. Crowley's long-term investment here sort of backs that they're putting their money where the mouth is and supporting that project.
Thank you.
And I would say, as for the cost, I'm not actually able to completely quantify it, which actually is a telling statement. So I could say, like, when we decide to do a high performance building, a passive house, all electric building, we assume something like that might add a 2 or 3% premium. That's something we're willing to take on because it's a requirement, like from who we are, that we need to be addressing the climate in the work that we do. Knowing that we needed a water dependent use, we needed something in that Commonwealth tide land. It could not be a building, and we had to build something there. Landscaping and this park was a great way to add more benefits to the community, and it was also a requirement. So I haven't actually pulled it out of the general landscape. I haven't asked for it to be itemized. It just needed to be funded, and we pull this all together. In affordable housing, you're mixing regular permanent loan mortgage with low-income housing tax credits, rebates, and other. There's a number of new, really great funding sources specific to climate focused, environmentally positive buildings like this that we could access. So we just have to make it work all together. There definitely is an added cost, but it's one we're just assuming is a cost to get this built.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Alice?
I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to remove our spotlights, and that way anyone who has their camera on can be part of the conversation. There are more folks who are here, but for the recording, I won't leave a bunch of empty squares with initials. We have one question in the chat so far from Magdalena, who wondered about the AMI for the affordable housing. What % of AMI are you targeting?
So the really wonderful thing about this project is with the Salem Housing Authority partnership, they are able to provide Section 8 project-based vouchers for 108 of 124 units. And the balance of the units will have those project-based vouchers from the state. We're waiting to hear on our funding in the coming months that we applied for, but should we be assuming we're funded, that will be the case. That allows for incomes of any level. Project-based vouchers have a cap of 50% of area median income, down to people who don't have any income at all, or really minimal income. So really excited that we could have very deep affordability here. That being said, underlying all of that, if project-based vouchers HUD provides 20-year contracts, they're renewable every 20 years, should that go away, which no one expects even in this polarized climate will happen. Underlying that, 25 units, which is 20% have a further restriction at 30% of area median income, and the balance of 99 units have restrictions at 60% of area median income or less. Kind of a two-phased answer.
Great, thanks. And Magdalena, feel free to either raise your hand or add in the chat if you have additional questions. Courtney, that was great background. Oh, Magdalena says, thank you. That's
Yeah,
better
sorry,
than
Alice.
Boston examples. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have spotty reception. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is actually a great project from my experience in public housing developments on the waterfront. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to pull Jules's question from the chat, and then I'll go to Charlie, who has modeled how to raise your hand. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you can go to the reactions button at the bottom, and one of the reactions is raise hand. So Charlie, we'll be right back to you. First, the question from Jules is that she's surprised that the Salem community sought a construction port and a power plant use. What made that direction so attractive to residents?
I think that the upfront planning and engagement that we did really drove the support for this use. So the property itself is within a state designated port area. There's, not to get too far into the weeds on that, but that's a very limited resource in the Commonwealth. There's 10 designated port areas. They are identified as being sort of priority areas for industrial development, industrial waterfront development. So when we started that, I say that because when we started the community engagement process, we really had to talk to the neighborhoods about what you can and can't do on the property. And the potential uses there without a potential legislative change really are limited to the marine industrial type uses. So you couldn't necessarily do housing there without legislation. But we didn't take that off the table. We did have the conversation locally about, could we modify those regulations to allow for a mix of uses? And, I think that it was a combination of both the history of the property and, the desire to see Salem's maritime heritage preserved, as well as the strong environmental advocacy voices that we have in Salem. So we have a group, Salem Alliance for the Environment, who is very involved in this, has a lot of support within the community. So folks wanted to see this site supporting renewable energy and wanted to see the port preserved. We also, we heard loud and clear too that public access was something that people were really interested in. So when we've been working with the Crowley team on the design process, we've been trying to find ways to incorporate public access into this industrial space. So, recognizing that we can't just have a harbor walk that cuts the property off from the waterfront, but there can be areas for the community to interact with the site, to learn about offshore wind, to learn about renewable energy. So looking at, interpretive signage and walkways around the property. So it really was this inclusive process with the neighborhood that I think built that support. So yeah, great question.
Thanks, Seth. Charlie?
Yes, I have two questions, one for Seth and one for Courtney. The first one for Seth is, what is the impact of the actual port activity and loading area as planned for the first phase on the adjacent ferry and cruise facility? Specifically, is there any additional parking? Does it curtail any of the small cruise vessel visits and so on and so forth? As that is an important pre-existing activity that had always been intended to be expanded if the opportunity arose.
Yeah, great question, Charles. So I think the specific details are still being worked out for how the port's going to operate, but it's important to remember that this port was historically an active import port for oil and coal vessels. So we've had large ships coming into Salem for the past 50 years. So it's really just sort of solving for the operational impact. So, making sure that there's coordination with the harbor master and with our port operators so that we can continue to have ferry access and continue to have the commercial marina that's there activated. We also anticipate we'll continue to have a similar level of cruise ship activity that we've had over the past decade or so. So I guess the short answer is we're planning and managing for that in a way that it should not impact the operation of the Blaney Street facilities. The Port Authority in Salem is also, which was the entity that I was involved with, is responsible for that Blaney Street property and is very much involved with Crowley and the team on the operational side. So, I think that's front and center to making sure that those operations continue.
Thanks. Can I go ahead, Alice? Quick question for Courtney. One of the biggest, this looks like a wonderful project and meticulous attention to all of the constraints that you have, resilience, tidelands, and so forth. One general issue for public housing, even if you control the site, is what the unit cost is and what the public-private split is between for capital investment. Do you have any general comments on that? I know this is something that a lot of communities struggle with, especially if you're trying to solve so many problems, which you've demonstrated in your presentation.
Could you say a little bit more specifically about the question of public-private? Which aspects are you wondering about?
Well, I think the first question is what is the anticipated unit cost per unit for the public housing, and then how is it going to be paid for? It sounds like you have a very interesting agreement in terms of retaining the ownership of the project, but at some point, I'm sure how that gets built, is it 100% Beacon or is it some combination? You mentioned a lot of opportunities for state funding and for various aspects of the project.
Sure.
Obviously,
So,
it's a complex question, but
yeah, there are a few pieces to that answer. The first is that it's actually technically will no longer be public housing. It will be privately owned by Beacon Communities affordable housing. So as affordable housing developers, we utilize all available funding opportunities to subsidize the difference between what it costs to build and what the rents that we will receive. Project-based vouchers allow us to get a much higher rental income to help support the operations, but that's still not enough. The mortgage alone, plus the 80% of the value of what we could get from the operating income will not cover the cost. So we utilize a federal and state low-income housing tax credit, stock funds from DHED, and some other funding sources, some great sources from the city of Salem, including ARPA and CPA and brownfields to take down the buildings. So we utilize all that. The Housing Authority remains, as I said, they will own the land. They will also oversee that Section 8 contract. So they will be the ones taking in the income information from the residents and qualifying them and then bringing them over to Beacon to process their lease. We do have a split between the Housing Authority and Beacon of developer fees, cash flow, and all, but it's really favorable for the Housing Authority. It's something that they don't currently aren't able to have, so it'll help them sustain their own operations and continue to do the work that they do well. I don't know if that answered your question. I don't know. Feel free to elaborate if you want me to expand on any of that.
I don't want to prolong this, but the reason I ask is that a number of cities who are involved in affordable housing are struggling with the issue that in order to meet all the standards for the housing, the cost of per unit actually is either as much or more than market rate housing. And so obviously you mentioned that there are cooperative agreements about capital costs, but have you been able to, and particularly with your experience in other communities, have you been able to wrestle with that issue of the actual unit cost?
Yes. So the cost, the total development cost to build this is extremely expensive. When I started doing affordable housing development in 2006, DHCD would not look at any total development cost more than $300,000 per unit, and that was kind of what the cost to build were then, including whatever acquisition cost you have. Now it could be upwards of 700,000 a unit. And that is kind of where we are here. So yes, this is, it kind of, perhaps goes to the earlier question about how do you, about these overall costs, and all of these things do add up. But the state knows, and the federal government with the IRA and ARPA has prioritized affordable housing, understanding how crucial this is, and the funding sources do cover that gap. So while it's astronomical, it is currently feasible. At the same time, some of the funding sources that we need know that they'll be tapped out in July or August of 2023, which means we might not be able to close in 2024 because all these projects are so much that they're really drawing a lot on this. So it's requiring a little bit of a time delay.
Thanks, Courtney. I'm going to go to a question from the chat or the Q&A and then come back to Vivian. Someone asked, what are the expected timelines for both the offshore wind project and the affordable housing project? So I guess questions to each set of presenters.
Yeah, so while Seth's rebooting, the permitting, as Seth said, for the offshore wind project is underway. Construction is anticipated to start later this year, and the construction would be done by the end of calendar 25, so that January 26 it would be available for operations.
And for Leefort Terrace, we'd hope to close this, assuming we get funding from the state's housing department this spring or summer. We were hoping to close in the fall of this year, but because of the constraints I just mentioned, it might push us into January of 24, a 2-year construction period, and then maybe 6 months to lease up. So 2026 will be in operations, ideally. And our permitting is all, except we're waiting, we're almost through Chapter 91, but otherwise our permitting is set.
Great. So it sounds like if you don't live in Salem, go check out these projects in 2026. They'll be ready to go. Magdalena also noted in the chat, for those of you who are watching the recording later, that Maverick Landing on the waterfront in East Boston was originally owned and managed by BHA and is now by Trinity Financial. So similar to what Courtney is describing for Salem. It ultimately creates the affordable housing as a benefit, which is a benefit. So thanks for that, Magdalena. And Vivian, your question.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with Charlie Norris asked on the affordable. There are different experiences along certainly Boston's waterfront. You have like Harbor Point in Dorchester, where there's an active tenants association for that part, which is the subsidized housing, to complement the market rate housing. And I think, people ask all the time, well, what do you think what's happening in Boston Harbor? And I think, looking back, Charlie and I and Al, have been involved for a long time along Boston's waterfront. I think certainly speaking for myself as a private citizen, I think the greatest disappointment is the lack of affordable housing. We never envisioned in a million years that gentrification would occur so quickly and so sharply along Boston's waterfront. I mean, we never, when we started 20 some years ago, really seeing some housing built, we never thought that basically Boston's waterfront, anything built right now, token gestures at affordability, but not what is really needed, and certainly not what is needed in the coming years ahead. So I just wanted to explore again the question that Charlie started to raise, and Magdalena obviously started even before that. Is there going to be some type of, you mentioned something about rentals and then ownership and such. Is it going to be such that those who are in the quote affordable, however we define affordable, will they have the same input that other units would? And also, when you talked about some of the public access areas just reserved for the residents, could you again explain, if I come to visit Salem, with people from Chinatown and Boston, would we be able to enjoy some of those private areas, or are they literally just for those who live in the housing? Thank you.
Sure, great, thank you. I'll start with the first set of questions. So to clarify, this building will be 100% affordable housing, deed restricted. So there is no distinction among the residents. They're all, of at least income qualified, which with the project, because of all the project-based vouchers, 50% of AMI or less for everybody. The Salem Housing Authority did a wonderful job just prior to putting out the RFP to find a development development partner, which we were ultimately selected for, and they created a tenant organization that has been very active. If you go to our website, leefortterrace.com, under the resident page, there's a wonderful video testimony from the president of the tenant organization, who's been a fantastic advocate and a fantastic advocate both in support of the project and in pushing us to make adjustments so that this really does meet what they will make the residents' lives as best as they can in this. I also did kind of want to take this opportunity to add on to the question about the public-private partnership to say this is the way that public housing gets redeveloped today. Funding sources no longer allow for public housing authorities. Some public housing authorities have the expertise and the ability to guarantees that are required to have guarantees of low-income housing tax credits. They can do their own development. It's very rare. Even the New York City Housing Authority doesn't do that. They put these out, the public-private partnerships, and then organizations like Beacon or Trinity Financial and the other example, or WIN, have access to the low-income housing tax credit market and can make these redevelopments happen. And then as far as the access to the space, the publicly accessible open space, yes, if you come when this is built, you could hop on a bike or walk on over. There's a wonderful bike trail system and enjoy the park, bring your hammock, put it up on a post. Monique did a fantastic job, who's here in creating this wonderful space that will feel the landscape and it'll feel serene and a really wonderful place to be right across from the cove. The private residential space, there's no gate, there's no fence. It's not technically, it's all of it is private property. There will be, it'll be clear that the front area along the cove is meant for everybody, and we would like a place. I think it will feel more private. If you're in the courtyard, you kind of feel like you're entering into a private property, but people can walk through, can cut through just like you would be able to pass. Actually, at the moment, you won't be able to pass through from one side to the other. Hopefully in the future, if the city is able to redevelop or create some other use for the vacant properties next to us, then there could be a pass through.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this point, but in Boston, there's a new chief of the housing authority, Kenzie Bach, who is extremely knowledgeable, former city councilor and such. And she just started, or she will just start, this month. So this whole discussion is very timely, and I'm going to probably suggest that she follow up with you. So thank you so much.
Sure, and to add to that, we partner with the Boston Housing Authority quite a bit. We're working on, we've been redeveloping the Oak Colony housing development for the last 10 or 12 years in partnership with the Boston Housing Authority, along with their Lenox and Camden developments. So yeah, we're looking forward to working with her as well.
Thank you.
Alice, if I could just add a little bit to that. So Courtney, I mean, the project is a great project, and with all the engagement Courtney has had, it still was tough. The permitting process was tough, and that's, despite the fact that the city has been doing years of education and building coalitions as well. I think, another project that was on one of the slides is wind development right next to the train station, a 120 unit building that is largely affordable. And for us, we're looking at affordability at 60% of the area median income or below. That had a lot of public process as well around it, which is part of a larger adaptive reuse of 2 historic court buildings. But even with that, again, while there wasn't as much pushback, I think, as Courtney received, there are questions, and it's understandable too. People asking like, well, how can you be doing this when flooding is going to be happening? And so for us, for the city, it's continuing that education about how you can build where something might flood on occasion, and what are the strategies to address things. And there are places where it's not appropriate. And I think, Courtney called that out as, before they proceeded, was looking like, does it make sense to develop here or not? So I see this as, for the city, still a lot of engagement and communication as we go forward.
Thanks, Tom. Al, do you want to wrap us up?
I do. First of all, thank you again to Tom, Seth, Courtney, and Ann. These presentations were wonderful, and more important, the projects that you were presenting about are wonderful. And thanks to everybody in the audience who listened in, and particularly to those who asked questions and participated in the discussion. And of course, thank you to Alice and Kelly for actually making this happen. As you recall at the beginning, we said we were recording this, and as a result of that, a recording of this forum, it will be available. Recordings of past forums are available as well. We'd encourage you to listen. There's a YouTube channel for that, and Alice will put the link to that in the chat. And finally, you can learn more about everything that we do at Boston Harbor now, upcoming events and our program and agenda. First of all, by going to our website, bostonharbornow.org. That's simple. You can sign up for our monthly email updates. Lots of people do that, or following us on social media. I see the link in the chat. And with that, thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of this lovely Wednesday.